This review will contain story and gameplay spoilers for Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 is an action horror game developed by Capcom and released for the Nintendo GameCube on January 11th, 2005. Resident Evil 4 reimagines the classic survival horror aspects of previous games by transforming them into an action title. It was met with positive critical acclaim and huge financial success. Around that time, I didn't even have a GameCube to play it and had to wait for the PS2 version. I was amazed by what I saw. The game was a technical marvel that played really smoothly. For better or worse, its design and mechanics heavily influenced the video game industry. 10 years after its initial release, I still consider it a masterpiece. Early 2005 was a very interesting time for video games. Video games were getting more and more popular, but niche titles were still coming out on a regular basis. The technology was getting better and better. Resident Evil 4 represents a big technological jump. It was unprecedented at the time. As a young kid, I distinctly remember marveling at enemies sidestepping the player's aiming reticle. The story in Resident Evil 4 is just sort of there. The main story involves Leon trying to rescue the president's daughter. As you can probably tell, it's your pretty standard cliché save the girl story. There's no serious character development or really any interesting moments at all. Every character is incredibly bland. The only thing that keeps me watching these cutscenes is the laughably cheesy dialogue.
Leon, I hope you can hear me. I'm Ingrid Hunnigan. I'll be your support on this mission.
Loud and clear. Somehow I thought you'd be a little older. So the subject's name's Ashley Graham, right?
That's right. She's the daughter of the president. So try to behave yourself, okay?
Whoever this group is, they sure picked the wrong girl to kidnap.
I'll try to find some more information on my end as well.
Good. Talk to you later. Leon out.
I still can't tell if it's intentional or not to this day. The performances are what really throws me off. The written dialogue is so cheesy, but the actors can play it completely straight. While the story and the characters are utterly forgettable, the gameplay is where it shines. Resident Evil 4 introduced some bold changes to the series. The game strays very hard and away from the series' core mechanics and reimagines itself as an action game. Instead of the static camera angles seen in previous games, the game now adopts a more standard third-person camera. The camera in Resident Evil 4 is deliberately placed over Leon's shoulder. Leon's character model takes up a good majority of the screen. The camera is angled so that the player can only see things to the right of Leon. There's always a fear of what's just on the outer reaches of the frame. With a manual camera, the camera can look to their left or their right, but once the stick is let go, it quickly recenters. This camera system gives the player just enough information and, at the same time, keeps them guessing. Additionally, if an enemy is just off to the left or right, Leon will look at them, indicating that there's a threat. This accomplishes what static cameras in previous entries, stressing the player with the fear of the unknown, set out to do, but still being viable for an action game. The new aiming system is just as elegant. This time around, by pressing the aim button, the player can fully aim in a 2D space relative to the screen with the stick. Think of it like moving a mouse on your computer. When aiming, the camera zooms even closer to Leon and restricts the view to just in front of him. This leaves the player very vulnerable from behind and to the left. In Resident Evil 4, each gun is equipped with a laser sight which acts as an in-game reticle. A small red dot appears when aiming at something the player can shoot. This instantly conveys what can or cannot be shot. I can't stress enough how much I love this because of its simplicity. There's absolutely no guesswork involved. The only downside is that shooting at longer ranges with normal weapons is tougher because the target is smaller. Thankfully, the level design rarely forces the player into shooting from long ranges with regular weapons. The player isn't allowed to move while aiming. Because of this, the player has to consider the space between them and their enemies and how long it'll take for them to line up their shots. Watching enemies get closer and closer as you line up your shots can be incredibly stressful and ultimately satisfying. Both the camera and gun mechanics perfectly synergize to create incredibly tense situations for the player. This pairing is the core to the game. It's clear that Capcom put a lot of effort into making them. Altering anything from this dynamic would negatively affect the intensity of the enemy encounters therein. If Leon could move and shoot at the same time, he could slowly back away from the enemies safely while easily dispatching them. If the camera was further back, or the players had full control, they wouldn't have to worry so much about their surroundings. Any of these changes would ruin the combat. While Resident Evil 4 made some massive changes to the core gameplay, it also kept some characteristics from earlier entries. Leon still controls like a tank. Pressing left or right on the analog stick rotates Leon around in a circle. Pressing up and down on the stick moves him forward and backwards in the game, respectively. The downside to these controls is that the player can't reliably move directly to the left or right of Leon. If the player wanted to do so, they need to rotate Leon, which is incredibly slow. As a result, enemies generally only attack in a straight line towards Leon and has a limited range. Moving closer or further away from enemies is a reliable strategy for avoiding attacks. For example, let's say Ganado throws a projectile. All the player needs to do is to move closer to him to avoid it. Surprisingly enough, a majority of these attacks can be avoided this way. It is incredibly satisfying to do so. In some cases, QuickTime events are used as a mean of dodging. While this is a nice concession, they aren't ideal since the player can't predict exactly where they'll land and they break the flow in gameplay. The inventory has been expanded to a grid. The player is only allotted a certain amount of space at any given time, and items take up a fixed space. In previous entries there were 8 or so slots, with each slot only holding one item. Now the player needs to account for item size, placement, and position in their inventory. I like the idea of managing supplies in space, but this same screen is used to change weapons as well. Pausing the action to change weapons interrupts combat, especially if you're changing weapons often. Another leftover from previous Resident Evils is the item pickup screen. Each time you pick up an item, a screen is shown, showing exactly what it is. This is quite unnecessary since you're picking up so much more items, and you can tell what it is before you pick it up. That being said, if it was removed completely, I would still miss it because of how iconic it is. Capcom should have restricted this pickup screen to just important key items. The game begins with Leon investigating a small village looking for the kidnapped president's daughter. He enters the house and is confronted by the first enemy. The majority of enemies in Resident Evil 4 are much more capable than lumbering zombies in previous games. They can run faster, are generally smarter, and can throw weapons. After killing the first enemy, the player jumps out of a window with a context-sensitive prompt. It might not be obvious, but this is actually a brief tutorial for the player. While saying this makes the game sound simplistic, these two actions carry on for most of the game. Killing enemies, and using context-sensitive button prompts for various actions from combat to using devices. Right outside the house, the number of enemies the player encounters triples. After they're defeated, the player discovers a trapped dog and some booby traps. You can choose to save the dog or leave him, but the way he's presented, it's very unlikely any player left him like that. Further down the path, there's a few more enemies and items. Dozens of enemies and even a mini-boss are thrown at the player in a big wide open environment to experiment and overcome. The sequence is incredibly chaotic and stressful and tops off as an excellent introduction. It's rare to see such a well-paced introduction in a video game. More importantly, the brevity of this tutorial doesn't slow down experienced players in their subsequent playthroughs. The pacing in Resident Evil 4 is immaculate. Each area and/or room acts as its own set piece. Throughout the game, the player is constantly being introduced to new scenarios. This type of pacing is present throughout the entire game, which is impressive. Even if you're not particularly a fan of the current challenge, you'll always know something unique is around every corner. While the game, especially in the village sequences, often forces you into visiting the same places, it's usually to access a new room you now have the ability to open. For example, starting off with the big bombastic village sequence, next is a smaller, creepier, and denser village sequence. Shortly after this QTE sequence, there's a house with tons of traps and new enemies wielding dynamite. Inside the house, we hear an ominous banging that gets louder deeper into the house you go. The player is introduced to Lewis, an ex-cop investigating the mysterious village. I could go into detail about every unique scenario, but I think you get the point. The game's set pieces become exponentially crazier from here on. After that, there's another open map with dozens of enemies with a key that requires 2 parts. The game constantly changes the level design and situations to make each room feel unique. Just like how every room was different in classic Resident Evils, the same philosophy is applied here in an action game. Honestly, this would have taken tons of energy from the developer, and it's really commendable. It's incredibly easy to reuse set pieces, and Resident Evil 4 very rarely takes this route. It's quite honorable, actually. Each set piece has its time to shine right before a new one is introduced. Shortly after meeting Lewis, you're introduced to the Merchant. The Merchant in Resident Evil 4 is arguably one of the most iconic characters in it. That's particularly ironic since he's almost purely utilitarian in design. He doesn't have any dialogue that isn't related to him being a merchant, and he doesn't really affect the story either. However, his visual design and unique voice makes up for this. Mechanically, he does what any normal video game merchant would do. He sells items, weapons, treasure maps, and gun upgrades. He offers a small side quest for the player to do and incentivizes them to explore the environment for treasure. Seeing his blue flame after a tough encounter brings this nice calm feeling. The merchant is almost exclusively the way to obtain new weapons. My problem is that buying weapons is just not as satisfying as finding them while exploring like in other Resident Evil games. Eventually, Leon will come to a lake and a docked boat. In this lake is actually the first boss encounter of the game. As a first boss, it's pretty disappointing. The player passively dodges driftwood and throws harpoons at the boss with no real control over Leon's movement. Each time the monster hits your boat, Leon is thrown overboard, triggering a quick-time event to get back on. Every now and then, the lake monster dives underwater to charge Leon head-on. The whole fight is very repetitive and cumbersome, especially on multiple playthroughs because of the lack of control. Back in 2005, the quick-time events that Resident Evil 4 had were incredibly unique for the time. Since then, and probably in part because of Resident Evil 4, they have been in many major releases. I still feel that quick-time events are a lazy way to make the player feel like they're doing something cool. Even so, I give Resident Evil 4 a pass because it introduced them into the action genre. But how do they hold up in Resident Evil 4? There's the mashing sequences where the player must repeatedly press a single button, and the boss/enemy specific dodge moves that I've already mentioned. There's also button prompts during cutscenes that makes the player instantly fail. They're also a core mechanic to the combat. If the player lands a headshot or a leg shot, the enemy is stunned, and if a player gets close enough, prompt appears to either kick or suplex. I'm not even kidding about suplexing. These quicktime events can be heavily abused since the player is invincible for the entire animation. This tactic, used in conjunction with the knife, is straight up overpowered. After the lake monster fight, Leon takes a little nap in a small cabin. Soon after waking up, a major new enemy is introduced called the Plaga. Enemies, whose heads are blown off, now have a chance for a parasite to pop out. This parasite has an incredible amount of range and is quite deadly. Later on, there are even versions of this enemy that can instantly kill you. This introduces the player in a unique risk-reward system. Should they aim for the head to kill people faster at the risk of a Plaga coming out? Or should they play safely and aim for the body but waste more resources? After a brief waterfall sequence, and right before the church where the president's daughter, Ashley, is held, the player faces the second boss fight, El Gigante. El Gigante's attacks are mostly avoidable through quicktime events, so it makes the fight relatively easy. For how big and brutal he looks, this boss fight is pretty underwhelming. The only real strategy is running away and quickly turning around to get a couple shots off and repeating this step. This boss fight is repeated multiple times throughout the entire campaign, so I don't really have an issue with him being so simple. If you help the dog earlier, he'll come and distract the boss for you. Overall, it's definitely a step up from the lake monster. Shortly after the boss, you rescue Ashley in the church. From here on out, you now have to escort Ashley around for a significant part of the game. This might sound like a pain, but it's really not. She closely follows you and ducks out of your reticle. You can command her to wait and do certain tasks for you, but otherwise it's lacking mechanically as your partner. I guess this makes sense because she doesn't have any combat experience, but it doesn't feel right how the player can just press a button and completely dismiss her existence. It isn't really a challenge to keep her alive, since she follows you so closely, and enemies for the most part try to carry her away instead of outright killing her. The only time I can see her being an issue is during boss fights, and she's conveniently missing for almost all of them. After a little bit of backtracking, Leon, Ashley, and Lewis get trapped in a cabin with a swarm of enemies approaching. Here, the player is required to fight off wave after wave of enemies. It's pretty enjoyable to shoot dudes with Lewis, and I'm honestly surprised there isn't another section like this in the entire game. After this sequence, the player has the choice of fighting 2 chainsaw zombie mini-bosses or fight another El Gigante. Each side has its own risks and rewards. The side with the Chainsaw Sisters has tons of enemies and some neat treasures. The El Gigante side has some treasures as well, but the boss can be skipped almost entirely. Or some players recording footage for a review will complete both sides because he thought it was interesting enough to mention. It's a shame that these types of choices are never seen again. I think it's a really cool way of enhancing the replayability. Honestly, I could go on and on about each little facet of cool shit within Resident Evil 4, but I think I've made my case. All the footage you've seen is only from the first area in the game. There's a really cool castle and industrial area as you progress. I could spend all day gushing about Resident Evil 4. I think if you're watching this and haven't played it, you really should. Seriously, it's been ported to several consoles and it's incredibly cheap. Even though it completely changes the genres for the series, Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest video games of all time. With its immensely tense gameplay and excellent pacing, it really has a lot to offer that most modern games don't. Sure, the story isn't as cinematic as modern games, but the story doesn't pretend that it's not an excuse for the excellent gameplay. It's that pure video game goodness that's missing from most modern games today. Despite some hiccups with the game design, the shooting and general feel of the game is what stands out after 10 years.